Oh my God! Wow.
Fifth grade teacher, Sandra Abramson.
Let me take your picture, because you asked me to take a picture.
Okay.
And I'm right here. Oh, this doesn't want to work now, of course.
Yeah, that can happen.
Oh, I don't know if it will or not. All right. I don't know. Jim and Michelle, did you take one? Good. Okay, we're set. Want the lights off?
What do you think? Can you see this all right? Should we dim one light?
Yeah.
See what it looks like? Dim one light. Yeah. How's that? Pretty good? Okay, I'll try to use this. Most of the time I can't stay with my script. Tonight I'm going to try, because there's so much that I found out. As Pat said, I first did this in March, and it was a Zoom presentation for Explore Buffalo, and I really wasn't happy with it. A, I don't like to do Zoom because you can't interact with people, and B, it just didn't feel right to me. So I've been in the process of doing a little bit more research, and I hope it turned out okay. But first of all, I'm with the Buffalo Presidential Center, as she said. And here's what we say. Buffalo has the richest presidential history of any city in the United States outside of Washington, D.C. That's what people say. They say, how can that be? Well, then you'll either have to come down to the Presidential Center for a little tour from me, or invite me back to prove that to you. Now, there may be some people in Boston or Philadelphia that may contest. I say bring them on, because I can really prove how rich Buffalo's presidential history is. And so why not start with part of that, Grover and Frances Cleveland. I'm going to start with Frances, and many of you would know, maybe some of you don't, that Frances was born in Buffalo. And she was born in that house at 168 Edward Street, and there is a historical marker right there in front. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a background. Her father was a guy by the name of Oscar Folsom, who was born in Folsomville in Wyoming County, and he was a rising lawyer, and he was also a partner of Grover Cleveland. And so when he bought 168 Edward Street, she was born there, and in 1864. 11 years later, on a carriage ride from downtown to there, he was killed in a carriage accident. And then, you know, they were law partners. They were good friends. Grover was single. He had a little family. Grover used to go there to eat all the time. They would invite him over to eat. And they had a little girl in 1864 by the name of Frances. And I'll get into more of that later. But it seems that not only was Oscar, he drank a lot, and he was also a gambler, but so Grover Cleveland took care of all of his debts when he died. And he also provided for the well-being of this young child, Frances. And Frances, a mother was named Emma. She lived in the house, and I think they moved up to Medina for a while, and then back to Buffalo. But let me tell you a little bit about her growing up. Folsom attended school at, I'm going to go on to that. She grew up and attended Madame Brecker's French kindergarten and Miss Bissell's School for Young Ladies, and that's where the upper class sent their young ladies to school. They were well trained, well prepared. It really guaranteed them a good education. And when she wasn't in school, she loved to hang around with Grover Cleveland, as she called him Uncle Steve. And she used to go out. She used to go out on Grand Island where they would hunt and fish and so forth. But then she at that time she had kind of this tomboy thing going on, and she liked to be called Frank, not Francis. And if I may suggest, one great biography of Frances Folsom Cleveland is this book called Frank. You really get a picture of how powerful she was and what her legacies were. She never graduated. She went to Central High School in Buffalo, but never graduated. She kind of dropped out in her senior year, and so it was actually Grover who used his influence as governor for her, or as mayor or governor, for her to be accepted to Wells College. And so she went off to Wells College, and as you see there, she earned a BA from Wells in Aurora in 1885, and later in life she served on the board. But also very important, she was very religious. At 14, she joined the Presbyterian Church, and she remained devoted to the church for the rest of her life, and actually got Grover to go more frequently than maybe he wanted. I mean, and actually, Grover's dad was a Presbyterian minister, so I don't know what that was all about. But Grover bought her first baby carriage and was just enamored with her, as you see there. She was a fashion icon. She was the Lady Diana, the Jackie Kennedy of the day. And her likeness, after they got married, her likeness was put on all sorts of items. And everything from, what I have it written down, but I'll come back to that. But really, they really merchandised her, and they didn't like it very much. But she had the whole package. She was young, she was beautiful, she had the engaging personality, she was smart, Wells College graduate, and she really did have the whole package, and no other first lady was ever received like this. So you'd have to go back to John Tyler's wife, who was young, but this was kind of unheard of. It was really a new era in commercial advertising, and so but she also went on later on in the campaigns of '88 and the campaigns of '88, because they were married in 1886. In the campaign of '88, they used her image on everything from posters, plates, ribbons, handkerchiefs, napkins, playing cards, and even cigar boxes. You would see her picture and her name on cigar boxes. Now the Clevelands, they really despise this, but they didn't have any control over it. I'll tell you a little bit later about this new exhibit that we're going to have in the Presidential Center, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a little while. So she was not a person who was interested in getting involved in politics. She was personally interested in it, but she did not support any political causes while she was First Lady. One exception to her avoidance of politics was her interest in the political situation in the Republic of Hawaii. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But she endorsed the restoration of the monarchy with Princess Kalealona and to claim the throne, because there was a group of people over there that tried to take over Hawaii. And she also supported the temperance movement, personally abstaining from any kind of drinking. And kind of interesting, because she had no problem with other people drinking, and she actually served wine at White House receptions. She really supported education, and one of her, again, she did not publicly support political causes while serving and so forth. But she really was focused heavily on the arts and women's causes and temperance. And a lot of people thought because she was so much interested in women's education that she would be a suffragist. She would be in favor of a women's suffrage. She was not. She was adamantly opposed to it. She was actually the vice president of the New Jersey Association opposed to women's suffrage from 1913 to 1920. That was the active period in this area for trying to get the vote for women. So she really avoided commenting on controversial issues during her tenure as First Lady. And like many anti-suffragists, female anti-suffragists of her generation, she felt that politics was an unfortunate duty to be avoided, and that it risked women's control of the domestic sphere. And so, but yet despite this, she chose to vote in elections after the ratification of the 19th Amendment. I mean, she decided to vote then, but she was very, very traditional, and a lot of women felt that way at the time. So let's talk about some of her legacies. For sure, she was loved and followed just like Jackie Kennedy, and I just can't tell you how they hounded her. They had such a difficult time from the moment they were married till the time that Grover died, and even afterwards. She was followed all over. And her reputation really influenced her role of the First Lady for generations after her tenure. She used actual form letters used by Cleveland as the First Lady remained in use, eventually being redrafted by Eleanor Roosevelt. So these form letters were used to send out to people. She was a prolific writer and diary keeper. And Grover was a prolific writer as well. But that's pretty significant. I think also in honor of Frances Cleveland, Cleveland Hall was constructed in 1911 in Wells College, because she was so much involved in that for almost her entire life. She was on the board of trustees of Wells College. And in 1982, there was a Siena poll, college research, and it ranked her among the greatest of all First Ladies. And if you read this book, you'll understand why. Even though she wasn't politically motivated, and even though she tried to stay away from the limelight, she isn't given credit for a lot of the things that she did. Charity groups that she was involved with. I mean, she had like 50 years of charitable work and giving, a philanthropist as well. And you may think, okay, now when I first read this, the Needleworkers Guild? Anybody got an idea what the Needleworkers Guild was? They sewed clothing for poor people. They sewed clothing and gave it away to veterans' families, to deceased veterans. Over 1 million pieces of clothing were handed down. She formed not only organizations in this state, but around the country. There were many charities, really too numerous to mention, but she was very much involved in supporting young women. Women's causes, not suffrage, but the education of young women. She was very much involved with the national organizations of Girl Scouts and YWCA and others. She thought that was one of the most important things that she could do, was to encourage education among young women, young girls. Very much interested in the arts. Culturally speaking, she was just the opposite of Grover. Grover, one of the books that he wrote, The Fishing and Shooting Sketches by Grover Cleveland. That's what he did. That's the way he got away. fishing, and hunting. She, on the other hand, was worked in a lot of different social circles, especially after the first term when they moved to New York City. She was so charming. Everybody loved her who met her. And all of the socialites embraced her, and she became very active in all of the cultural events, whether it was music, artistry, writing. She was a lifetime learner. She even in her 60s, she was still taking courses and learning. She learned German because of Grover, and when she went to Europe after he passed away and spent a lot of time just taking courses and learning languages. So she was a brilliant and woman, and in a lot of ways they led kind of separate lives. But one of the things that she was most proud of, and somebody asked her later in life, what was she most proud of? She said one of the things was that she believed in free kindergarten. And she started free kindergartens in New York State. And she was very much involved with that for a long time. So she was most proud of her charitable work and also working with children and young women. There we go. I'm off script already. So I think really it pretty much covered what was there. Oops, wrong way. Oh, yes. And there were some more, she was Buffalo's only first lady and also the youngest first lady, the only one to be married in the White House up to that point. She was the first lady to actually give birth to a child in the White House. Now, that was the second child. That was Esther, who was actually born in 1893 when they were back in the White House for his second term. And in that second term, she gave up a lot of her social activities in the White House to play with the children. She'd actually get down on the ground and play with the children, her children. And then when they left the first time and the second time, 3,000 people attended the First Lady's final Saturday reception to shake her hand. She wept as she left the White House, personally saying goodbye to each member of the staff. This organized farewell would be replicated by future First Ladies, becoming a tradition even today. So, you see the child on the right. So that was her first child. Baby Ruth was born in between presidencies. She was born in 1891. Okay? And so there's a picture of her on the right. But how many of you have heard about the candy bar controversy? So you may know what's going on here. The Curtis Candy Company had this very successful candy bar called the Candy Cake. It was called the Candy Cake from 1900 to 1920. And then all of a sudden in 1920, when Babe Ruth broke the record for home runs, they changed the name and maybe the ingredients somewhat to the Baby Ruth Candy Bar. And so Babe Ruth, the ball player, said, nay, nay, nay. You named that after me in order that you could profit by my name. And they said, no, we named it after Baby Ruth Cleveland. And he said, Baby Ruth Cleveland died in 1904. This is 1920. Why did you wait so long to name it that way? And Curtis Candy Company said, well, we didn't spell the candy bar B-A-B-E. We spelled it B-A-B-Y after Baby Ruth Cleveland. Well, Ruth sued, but in 1932, I guess, they had a lot of court action, but in 1932, he actually lost the case. Hey, big business, you don't mess with big business. Curtis Candy Company, you don't mess with them, right? So that's kind of the story there. Now we're going to switch over and talk about Grover, the young Grover. So as I said before, Grover's dad was a Presbyterian minister, and in the day, these Presbyterian ministers used to, they would be appointed. You're going to go to that church. You're going to go to that church. They switched them around quite a bit, and he was, Grover was born where his dad was a pastor in New Jersey, Caldwell, New Jersey, in 1837, and then when his dad dies, he's 16 years old, and then he goes out to work because he's one of the guys in the family, I think 9, one of the guys in the family, he's got to go out and earn a living for his family. And so he goes out and he works in a trade. He didn't like that at all. So when he turns 18, he says, you want to know something? I'm getting out of town. I'm going to go where the grasses are greener. There's this guy out in Cleveland, Ohio, Moses Cleveland, my namesake. I'm going to Cleveland, Ohio, and I'm gonna make my name in Cleveland, Ohio. Well, on the way to Cleveland, he was traveling with a buddy of his. They're 18 years old. On the way to Cleveland, he stops in Buffalo because his father's sister, his aunt, is married to a guy by the name of Lewis Allen. Allentown? Allen Street? Grand Island? Lewis Allen was one of the most successful farmers, businessmen, and political strong men at the time. And he says, Grover, you don't need to go to Cleveland. Your future is here. So he works a little bit for his uncle, and then they get him. He gets him into a law firm to clerk. And so he clerks for 3 years for the law firm. And, in those days, they didn't have law boards. You went and you clerked. And if you worked hard, and if they liked you, and if you were a man, you were admitted to the law firm. You passed the bar of that day, okay? It wasn't an exam. It was another kind of bar. And so he passes that. He becomes a lawyer, and he then gets involved in politics. First, he's a ward chairman. Oh man, he decides he wants to be a Democrat. And his uncle Lewis Allen was a Republican, as was almost everybody else in Buffalo, a Republican of the day. Democrats hadn't won an office in years, since before the Civil War. And so they get him to run for Erie County Sheriff. But before that, as I was going to say, he's appointed Assistant District Attorney, and he's a ward chairman of the Democratic Party. And then after working in the law for a while, he becomes Erie County Sheriff. He had served one term as Erie County Sheriff. It was a really unremarkable term. He probably made some good money on that because he used to collect the fees. He even collected the fees for hanging a couple of felons. Do you know where the downtown library is? That big structure now. And before that, it was a downtown. It was the Erie County library. And before that, it was the county court, prison, It was the police headquarters and the fire headquarters, the public service building. So right on that property, he actually, whether he actually pulled the string or not, a couple of felons were hung during his term. He only served one term. I don't know whether that had anything to do with it or not. I think he just wanted to get back to the law. He didn't really very much like that. And so he's practicing law for a while, and then in 1880, they get him to run for mayor. And again, remember I said the Republicans controlled everything? They controlled city council. They controlled all those very handsome contracts that the city council approved. There was a ton of corruption. not just in Buffalo, but a lot of in New York City, all over the state, a lot of corruption. And so no other Democrat wanted to run for mayor. They finally convinced him to run, thinking he won't win, but let's just put him up there. Well, he campaigned on the political platform of no corruption, no patronage, and there would be no more control by the city council. And so he started vetoing everything that they put forth. He became known as the veto mayor. He wouldn't hire his political cronies. He didn't believe that you should just hire friends, neighbors, relatives, and political operatives. Okay? He didn't believe in that. He wanted to hire people that were qualified for the job. And he did that. He promised he would do that. And after a year, the political people said, let's run him for governor. He'll never win. He's a Democrat. Democrats never going to win governorship in this state. So they run him for governor on the same platform, and he wins. And he does the same thing in Albany. He vetoes everything. He fights against Tammany. He really goes after. He doesn't hire all the political cronies. They got together and said, let's run him for president. He'll never win. So he runs for president on the very same platform. And he wins. It was a very controversial election. I'll get into it a little bit more. So then he's mayor and governor, and then he obviously becomes president in 1884. He is a really tightwad when it comes to finances. He was that way in his personal life. He didn't want to spend anything, only if it was absolutely necessary. And he was the same way in his political career. He was a tightwad. And he was known as the veto president. He said, a public office is a public trust, and I am going to hire only the best to do the jobs for the people. He believed in civil service reform. And he, I guess, I got off the script again. Is that all right? Am I doing okay? Yeah. So he believed in civil service reform. I'm going to read this to you. He was inclined to follow the example of his predecessor, Chester Arthur. He also lobbied heavily by good government groups who wanted to establish merit as the basis for appointments and promotions. Now you have to realize that presidents in this day and even before, one of their primary jobs was appointing people. They spent most of their days with people filing into their offices waiting to be appointed as a postmaster in some small town in New York or Ohio or wherever. And so a lot of his days were filled with that kind of stuff. And what he said was, I don't care who you are, I want to know how good you are at what this job is. I mean, he went so far, his best friend and law partner, Wilson Bissell, wanted to be hired as the ambassador to England. That's something that normally you would do. I mean, Wilson Bissell, he's an attorney, a good, clean-cut man, upstanding man. Grover said, no, I can't do that. It wouldn't look good. It would look like I was giving favor to my best friend. I'm not going to hire you for that job. Well, later he appointed him postmaster general in his second term. But it gives you an idea of how committed, how determined, how moral he was in the way he looked at his jobs in public service. Yeah, and so later on he did expand in 1888 the Civil Service Act, and his whole attitude was anti-corruption, and that really was the hallmark of his life, and certainly his political career. Now we get to, okay, who heard about the Child? I'm sure many of you have read City of Light. And you get a very appointed image of who Grover Cleveland was. Grover Cleveland was portrayed in the press and in the pulpits as being not a good man. He was in the press. He was accused of being a philanderer. But Grover Cleveland, and he did apparently have an affair. He was a single guy. He hung around the bars and the restaurants and the hotel lobbies, and as a young single guy, he's looking at what young single guys at bars look for. And so he had an illicit affair with this Maria Halpin. And in some people's minds, Maria Halpin had illicit affairs with a lot of other men. But Maria Halpin had a child. And the child was, they tried to cover it up. The child was put in the Presbyterian home for children. That was for orphaned children. And she was put into, they called it a sanitarium at the time. I'm not really sure what the exact story is. But the child was in this orphanage for a little while. And while he was there, Grover Cleveland took responsibility for fathering this child. Proof of that is in the Buffalo Presidential Center Museum. And you will see on display a letter written in pencil from Grover Cleveland to the headmistress of the orphanage, the Presbyterian home for children. And in that letter he said, "I am off to New York for a while. Will you please buy the boy a Christmas present? I have no idea what to get him, of an appropriate gift to give him. I will reimburse you when I get back from New York." So that's a handwritten letter that my friend and I found on eBay once, and so now it's in the museum. But he takes responsibility for the child. But the child is then adopted by two doctors, a husband and wife doctor. And the child then grows up in that family and becomes Dr. James King. And Dr. James King was a gynecologist who never married, no children, no DNA, and he was also he was a gynecologist, and he also taught at UB. I mean, and he died, I think it was the same year as Francis Folsom Cleveland, 1947, and there was never any way of determining was he actually Grover's son or somebody else. And of course, there is a perspective from Grover Cleveland's family in particular. If you look at the image of Grover Cleveland, and then you look at the head image of James King, don't look much alike. But that doesn't mean that he couldn't have inherited, from the mother's side or whatever. So there was also rumors that she was impregnated by Oscar Folsom Cleveland, because when the child was born, they named him Oscar Folsom Cleveland. Oscar Folsom being Francis's father. So who knows? Unless someone were to exhume his body and check the DNA, there's really no way of knowing the bottom line of that mystery. But I had to bring it up to you. So, what's going on time? Okay? Okay. Urban myths. Aha. How many of you have been to Grover's on Transit? Right. So what does it say on the back of the menu? Grover Cleveland's Honey Lodge. Nay, nay, nay. That's been disproved many times. Now, Grover Cleveland has a grandson. He's 72 years old. Believe it or not, a direct grandson. How? When Grover Cleveland was 60 when his fourth son, Richard, was born. His fourth son, Richard, was married twice. The first wife he divorced because she was an alcoholic. He remarried, and like his father, remarried a much younger woman and gave birth to 3 more children. And one of those children was my friend George Cleveland. One of the times, several years ago, I took George to Grover's for dinner. And the waitress came up, and I said, we have a celebrity here. Here is your namesake. This is George Cleveland, Grover Cleveland's grandson. What do you want to eat? No. Sorry. It wasn't his fishing and honey lodge. He did all his fishing and honey, most of it, as I understand, on Grand Island at his Uncle Louis Allen's place. So, I spread another urban myth. And I was spreading that for years until my friend Don Sean, who most of you know, got digging into some local history. And we found out that indeed here is the written indenture of a piece of property that was owned by Grover Cleveland, and it was lot 26 on this map, and you'll probably see it up here, because this property was owned by Grover Cleveland. I think he bought it in 1876, 1877, and I refused to believe this until Don showed me this. I said, how did he get here? You know, it's a long train ride, or whatever, carriage ride, or whatever. How did he get here? And what did he use the property for? You know what I mean? There was that big mystery. Don said, here's the proof. And so this lot 26 is mentioned on the indenture, right here that Don dug out. So, I was spreading an urban myth for a couple of years. He also owned a piece of property in downtown Buffalo on Lexington Avenue, and that one was sold in 1890. Both of those properties were sold in between terms. Once he left in 1884, the way he was treated by the press and a lot of people in town, he never really came back very much. 2 or 3 times, briefly. So, but he sold that lot, and he never built on it. It was just a lot. And I have a feeling that since it was in Allentown, in that area, that it was likely given to him by his Uncle Louis Allen at some point in time. Don't know for sure. I'm guilty. No more though. Of telling the urban myth. Okay, so his legacy is really a mixed bag. There was a political cartoon that came out in the election of 1844, all to do with the illegitimate child. And there was a cartoon that came out that says, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" referring to the child. And after he won the election, the refrain was, "Gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha." He was up against James Blaine, and although this controversy, this smear, was really not enough to hurt him in the election, I think primarily because his opponent, James Blaine from Maine, was a well-known for bribery, put it bluntly. He was in the Senate, and he took bribes all the time. It was just well-known how corrupt he was. And of course, Grover was running on an anti-corruption campaign, as I said before. And but that said, Grover the Good was his nickname. A lot of people loved Grover. He was one of the most revered presidents of the day. even though his second term was just awful. The second term almost killed him. Started off with the Panic of 1893, a very severe depression. And then they got into the Pullman strike, and he didn't act, and he didn't act, and it was a fight between labor unions that were being cheated, individuals that were being cheated by this guy Pullman, who built Pullman City to build these very high-end railroad cars, and he waited and waited and waited, and then finally he had the troops sent in to quell the riot, because there were riots that went on for weeks. And but he took a big hit, both from the unions and from big business, because he sent in the troops to end it. So, but he was a true reformer at all leadership levels in an era that was dominated by robber barons and corruption, cronyism. He had a very big success in Venezuela, strengthening the Monroe Doctrine peacefully. There was a conflict with Great Britain, and so he managed to solve that without having to go to war. Another positive, he's obviously the only president to have two non-consecutive terms as president, and yet he won all 3 popular votes. Not the most contested in history, and I'm doing another program on contested presidential elections next week in the Clarence Library. I've referred once before about Frances Folsom Cleveland and her support of the Queen and the monarchy in Hawaii. What happened is you had a bunch of industrialists in Hawaii who I'm trying to find my notes on that, but they tried when the king of Hawaii died, or the queen died, these fruit farmers, like Dole Company and that, they all got together and they overthrew the monarchy. And I'll get to that. At any rate, the previous president, Hayes, they passed a law that we could go over and we could take over the island of Hawaii. And then, but the Democrats stalled it, and they wouldn't pass that law until after Grover Cleveland came in. They wanted Grover Cleveland to get the credit for taking over and annexing Hawaii. And when he came back, what he said was, I'm not going through with this. This is not like this United States. We don't do this just take over islands. We try to make our country better as it is right now. I'm not signing that bill, and we're not taking over Hawaii. We're going to put the young queen Liliuokalani, can't pronounce it without seeing it. But at any rate, they were. He refused to do that, and so Hawaii has always been a favorite. Cleveland's always been a favorite of the state of Hawaii. If you've been to this statue next to City Hall, on the back of it says his very last words when he died in 1908. He said, "I have tried so hard to do right." There have been many observable reminders of his name and as president, mayor, governor, and the statue north of City Hall, as well as the bust that's inside. You have Cleveland Hall on the Buffalo State campus. You have Cleveland Hill School District, you have Cleveland Golf Course. So all around town we have we have Cleveland's name imprinted on that. Let me show you a picture of the Cleveland family in 1907. This picture was taken shortly before Grover died in 1908. By the way, he was not a healthy man. You know how I think they use the word corpulent.
What is it?
Corpulent, which is large, big. And it was usually with prominent, heavy-set gentlemen. He was really heavy, and he was a big eater and drinker, and he really didn't take care of himself, and he had some stomach disorders. He had, but he also had a bad heart, and the last few years, Frances spent most of her time taking care of him and their children. And when he died in 1908, she had 4 young children to take care of. And those children were, you see him on your right, and then Frances in the back, and then up here to the left of Frances, that's Esther, who was born in 1893. She's the one who's born in the White House. The slightly younger daughter is Marion. She was born in 1895. The young boy next to Grover is Richard. And Richard was the father of my friend George Cleveland, the grandson. Okay? And then the little one there is Frances, with an I. And so they were in Princeton, New Jersey at the time. They decided they wanted a quieter life in Princeton, New Jersey, rather than New York City, where they were in between terms. So Frances continues her work, but takes care of the children. She stays in Princeton. She does a lot of traveling. She travels a lot in Europe with her mother, Emma, and because one of her children, Esther, was in England with children, and so she did a lot of traveling in Europe. And when she came back in 1913, she marries a professor, Thomas Preston. So she actually marries for the second time. She's still a fairly young woman, and then they have a delightful time together because he is very much like her. The arts mattered a lot to him, and so they did a lot of traveling. So he was very, very just the opposite of Grover. That's not. I mean, in a way, Grover and Frances led separate lives because he was a workaholic. He was known to work until 2 or 3 in the morning. They would get up and have breakfast at 9 in the morning, and then he'd do his work, and then every day they were in the White House. She demanded they go out for a ride, a carriage ride, just around. That was her 1 hour with the president alone. But she suffered a lot of alone time because he was just always so busy. And then, when he did have free time, he was off hunting and fishing. His big deal. And he didn't want to go to ballets. He didn't want to go to hear a lecture. He didn't want to hear a Philharmonic. You know, he wasn't into that. He was kind of all guy, right? So, and anyway, that's the story, but I'm not done. Because in a couple of weeks, November 2nd, at the Buffalo Presidential Center on the 2nd floor of the Downtown Public Library, I am going to tell the story of the Cleveland family hat and box mystery. This hat and box and the trunk that it came in was donated to the Buffalo Presidential Center by the Cleveland family. The question is, who did that riding hat belong to? And it really deals with the whole idea of, well,
Aunt Sadie said it belonged to so-and-so, and then it came from there, So that's why it really belonged to him. So it opens up the question of provenance. So I'm going to be telling that story very briefly, and we are going to, because we believe in Grover and Francis so much, there's so much to tell, we are opening a new display area in our museum called the Cleveland Corner. And we're going to have artifacts and information about the wedding. We're going to have artifacts and information about the merchandising of the First Lady. And then we're going to have a board on Baby Ruth and the children. So this display, you're going to find out the mystery, and we're going to unveil these things that you see up here. That's all, folks. That's all, folks. Just want to remind you one more time, second floor of the Downtown Public Library, you won't be disappointed. We're only open on Saturdays from 10 until 4. And if you come on November 2nd, we're going to have refreshments. Between 1 and 4, and I will be speaking at 2 o'clock. And we'll be having the unveiling at that time as well. So we really appreciate it, because here's the thing. We survive and tell the stories of Buffalo's rich presidential history with donations and with memberships. That's how we survive. We're doing a pretty good job of it, but we can always use more help. So if you want to come on down for free refreshments and solve the mystery with me, maybe I've got a few extra bucks you can slip our way. Or if you want to, you can join the Presidential Center, because we have ongoing programs at our space and other places all the time. Not so much in the winter, of course. And we also have a speakers bureau, as I was telling Pat. If you go to the speakers bureau, we have 5 members of our board who do somewhere between 30 and 35 different programs on Buffalo's presidential history, mostly. There's some others in there. But we got a couple of good programs coming up beside that. It's tonight. It's on Shirley Chisholm. They're having one at the Buffalo Presidential Center tonight. On Shirley Chisholm, they had a reenactor come in as Shirley Chisholm. But we're going to have a couple coming up in November. One is going to be about Lee Harvey Oswald, and it's going to be Assassin or Patsy, and all about the Dealey Plaza. So we're going to do that right about the Thanksgiving, right about the time that Kennedy was assassinated. And we also have a one before that on the 2 wives of Millard Fillmore. So we usually have those on Thursdays around 5 o'clock. Millard Fillmore had 2 wives, yes.
Oh, wives.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I saw it said you said 2 lives.
Whoa, that would be a good topic. Okay, any questions? Yes, sir.
I've been holding it all in. When he was such a reformer, when did the friends and family and corruption come back into the White House? Is there a particular personality that went back to normal?
I would say, at least, if you're talking about corruption, you go to Warren Harding and the Ohio
Before
and
or
after 1920, 1923. Warren Harding had one of the most corrupt, not because he himself was corrupt, because he brought in all his crony buddies to be in important positions, and they profited from that. And there's something called the Teapot Dome scandal.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that occurred. That was the big one that occurred. And then after him, his vice president was Calvin Coolidge, Silent Cal. He was a straight-laced guy. But I would say, in terms of corruption, it's always been at the local level. I mean, it's going on right now in New York City and and elsewhere. Chicago's well known for it. I mean, even Youngstown, Ohio, and I mean, it's all over locally. But
presidentially, my view, it would be the next time we got into a president whose administration was corrupt, that was Hoover. Harding. Before that, 2 elections, the election of 1876 with Hayes and Tilden. Holy cow. That was, I get into that in this other talk that I do on third parties and contested presidential elections. That's what I'm doing next Thursday at the Clares Library. So I'll just leave it at that.
So it was only a partial joking question. I mean it. We have a long tradition, both locally and federally,
We
and
do.
in the state. They're always under investigation, and if the government was honest, they'd all be under investigation all the time. So it's,
You know, and Grover Cleveland was the epitome of that honesty.
see, I never heard that.
And he again, his best friend and law partner, he wouldn't appoint as, that's the extent that he went in terms of his honesty and his,
To a minor appointment. Ambassador to England, big deal.
Exactly. At the time it was big, but, any other questions? Thanks. Yes, sir. Ma'am.
Do you have any idea how old Francis and Grover were when they got married?
Yes, I do. Grover was 49. Francis was 21. Ooh. Not unusual for that day.
At least she was 21.
Well, yeah, she had just graduated from Wells College. He wanted to make sure that she graduated from college and that she did the grand tour of England or Europe with her mother. And when they came back, there was speculation who was going to be the first Mrs. Cleveland. Everybody, odds were that the first Mrs. Cleveland was going to be Oscar Folsom's wife and Francis's mother, Emma. So you have to realize that when he took office in 1885, that whole year, his sister Rose acted as First Lady. And so when they came back to Washington in what they called the social season, Rose didn't come. And so the tongues were wagging then and saying, okay, who's it going to be? Because we need a First Lady here. He's going to get married, isn't he? Yes, sir.
For those that don't know, Wells College is the one in the Finger Lakes?
Yes, in
Oh,
Aurora.
Women's college?
Yes, it is. And they just closed, by the way.
Oh, they did?
Yeah, I think just this past year. They closed for good.
Tough for colleges.
Yeah.
Small ones.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Where's lot 26?
Lot 26, you can check out my map, but I think it's right here on this map too, but I'll show you on mine if you want to come up and look at it. It's right downtown on Main Street, to answer your question.
It's where Stone's
Park.
drugstore used to be. Did you know Stone's?
What?
Did you know Stone's drugstore?
Stone's Drugstore. Well, here it is. This is lot 26. This was from 1855. I think it's the same
Lot
map.
26,
similar.
it's
So
Russell
that's
Park.
the park?
It's
Well, lot
across from the
26
park?
is the big.
No, that is Russell Park.
That is the park, 26. Okay.
Okay.
We have the deed to that in the museum, to that property.
This
with
property
with
here?
their signatures on it.
Okay,
Yes.
so
Yes.
Don must have given that to you, too. He
Well,
gave it.
you were part of it,
Okay.
acceptance of that.
Oh.
The Stone family, who had the Stone drugstore, contacted Michelle, our publicity person, and said they had the deed and they would like to donate it to the museum. And so
Oh.
we have it framed in
Oh.
our research room.
Okay.
And it has his signature on it.
Yeah, same here.
And it's where Stone's drugstore was
Yeah.
at one time. Now it's marked the Grover Cleveland building. It actually has that lettering
Oh, does it really?
on
Okay,
the door,
great.
on the glass door. It's marked the Grover Cleveland building. It's on Main Street. The Freemans own that building. Yeah, where we did the Bell exhibit. I don't know if you came to the Bell exhibit during the bicentennial.
The doll.
That's the building, right there.
It's not often that I have local flavor in my talk. But I was so excited to come out here because it's couple blocks from here, right? And it really ties in to something that I really never believed. But I'm
He
happy.
owned other property here too.
He owned another property?
Yes, because I do the Century stuff, so I see people's abstracts. And what used to be Ross's funeral home, the building next to that, he had his name on that as a purchaser.
I wonder what he saw in Akron all the way from
Fishing,
fishing?
Murder
Probably
Creek.
hunting.
There's lots of
Fishing.
rumors that he
Creek.
fished in Murder Creek.
Murder Creek. That's it.
But I also think when he was sheriff, that he had firsthand knowledge of what properties came up for sale, because it seemed to me that he owned several properties, which, I mean, some people do, but still.
Could you ask her to put the microphone to her mouth and tell me?
No. Yeah. Okay, go ahead. What did you want to know?
What you were just saying.
Okay. Well, there's where Stone's drugstore used to be on Main Street. It's owned by the Freemans, who own the sport shop and so
Yeah.
forth. Okay, on the door, it says Grover Cleveland Building.
Okay.
And they offered the deed up to the Historical
Well, that's what I
Society.
heard.
Yeah.
You're just verifying
Yeah.
what I knew.
But I also think I know for a fact that he owned, do you know where Ross's old funeral home used to be? Okay, that little house there, the house next to it, he's on that deed too. He's on that abstract, I should say, as owning that for a very short period of time. Very short period of time. But I think when he was sheriff of Erie County, he had, he knew what buildings came up for sale. I believe he owned several different buildings that he, used to buy them up and resell them,
Okay.
from what I've seen.
That, you see, almost every time I do a talk, I learn something new. Thank you. And this is great. Yes,
I'm
another.
fascinated, was the Folsom family like prominent or wealthy? Because I wonder what this woman
Yeah.
saw in him being such a drunk and a womanizer.
I think his wife Emma was more so than him. It's so hard to find out any information about him, other than he was born in Folsomville, and I can't even get an image of him. I don't know what he looked like. So I would like to have an image of him to put up on that screen.
Yeah, I just wonder why she would marry a guy like that.
He was an up and comer. He was a brilliant young lawyer, and so she saw potential in him, and he must have been a charmer too.
Yeah. I can see why they didn't use him as an advertising icon. They used her instead.
Oh, you ought to. If you come down to see the new exhibit, we'll have all kinds of stuff that show what was used without permission of her images on almost anything that you can imagine. Any person who wanted to advertise their funeral home or their cigars or whatever, silverware.
See, I never heard that.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes, he was in Folsomville. That was in Wyoming County?
Yes.
What part of Wyoming?
It's near Addison. It's what?
It's in Folsomdale Road.
Colsondale Road.